Our reading this morning is from Matthew, and just to put it in context, if this means anything to you, this is right before the Beatitudes. This is right before blessed are the fill in the blank. Blessed are. So this is really the lead-in to that moment. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news, and healing every disease and every sickness among the people. Soon he was known, and they brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and oppressions, demoniacs, epileptics, paralytics, and he restored them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee, across the borders to Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. And when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain and he sat down. And then he began to speak. Now, the Sonoran Desert was a lot colder than any of us imagined it would be. And we were standing intermingled with cacti and other thorned bushes that I had never seen before. And we had recently heard the yips of some coyotes that were not all that far away. But now it was quiet. In a moment of silence, the words from the poem Home by Warsan Shide hung in the air. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. Standing in a semicircle around a white cross made from used piping, decorated only with a small sticker of the Virgin Mary, a pair of sunglasses hanging off the horizontal pipe, and a small sign that says, Adolescente desconocido. Adolescent, unknown, or stranger, or one unmet. And then the Reverend Randy Mayer, our guide and host of this desert walk, shouts into the silence, Presente! Exactly. And we all responded together by calling in unison, Presente! Our words buzzed in the silence. And then we moved on to the next cross. 2 weeks ago, a group of Plymouth members and friends visited the borderlands of the United States and Mexico in and around the Tucson, Arizona area. Who here was on this particular trip? Okay. In February of 2020, right before the pandemic arrived, another group did a very similar trip. Is there anybody here who was on that one? Okay. Good. You can help us. For 1 week, we were invited into the culture, the politics, and the humanity of one section of this invented line that separates two nations and where a crisis has formed. It is now a line made real with walls and razor wire, heavily armed law enforcement and entry bottlenecks, human trafficking, poverty, and death. It is also a line surrounded by justice and peace-inspired public art, Samaritan groups in the desert seeking the lost and delivering water, legal advocates, church-funded shelters, and vigils that never let us forget the human toll that this imaginary line through the desert has caused. And we made ourselves present. We were present to suffering and compassion, to love and to bigotry, to violence and to sanctuary, to apathy and to action, from the life-giving to the death-dealing. We made ourselves present to it all. Presente means present, to be present in Spanish, and it is shouted as a declaration. We are here. We are witness. We will remember. We are present. And so I invite you to join in that little voice from the back that joined in a moment ago and participate in this call and response ritual of naming your presence this morning. And those of you who did this in the desert or at a vigil, model that it's okay to be loud in church. When I say presente, please say it back. I'll pronounce it for you. Presente. 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 Well done. I was worried I was going to have to urge you on. That was excellent. The border wall that runs through Nogales in Mexico and stretches far, far beyond is made of steel beams stuck into the earth and shoot upwards for about 20 feet. And the city of Nogales sits right against the border, so that the wall is across the street from people's homes and businesses and from the life of the city. But on the U.S. side of the wall, it is nothing other than razor-sharp concertina wire and a metal grate to make sure that nobody can put their hands through and pass something or touch somebody. On it, there were spray-painted slogans like, "Sin justicia no hay paz." Without justice, there is no peace. And we placed our hands on the thick steel beams and stood in prayerful silence. The metal was so cold. And I kept expecting my own body heat to warm the surface under my skin, but instead the cold started to push into my own body. It felt as if my own blood began to carry the cold, lifeless essence of this wall into me, like I was being infected by warning, by fear, by the menace that this wall held. And I was able to feel the cold for a long time afterwards. It stuck. We were present to this metallic embodiment of violence and scorn. Presente. Presente. Afterwards, we spent much of the day at Casa de Misericordia, House of Mercy in Nogales. This shelter houses, feeds, and educates people forced into migration as they await their permission to seek asylum in the United States. Because of climate change and racism and gangs and cartels, generational poverty, genocide, political instability, corruption, and multinational corporate expansion, many people migrating to our country do so because, like the words of the poet, home became the mouth of a shark. Casa de Misericordia can hold hundreds of adults and children as they sit with the unbelievably slow and laborious asylum process. The facility was on top of a hill and it was lovingly cared for. Lika, the director and former nun, told us her story of how she came to finally create this safe space as men and women were baking bread in a home-built wood fire oven. We were fed delicious chicken, soup, rice, beans, and salad in a dining room, while on the other side, a lawyer from the Jewish refugee advocacy group HIAS taught 50 or more people, mostly Venezuelans that day, what they will encounter in the complicated American immigration system. We then sat in another room with a dozen migrants and heard a young woman's awful story of violence and forced migration. We let the story lower onto our hearts, and we listened as our conversation partners responded with their own experiences. And then we read the Beatitudes from Matthew and let those words enter into the conversation along with the other stories. We heard people speak of an astounding faith molded by loss and suffering. One woman commented that faith is when God fills you up from the inside. We were present to resilience and suffering, to loss and hope, to faith and despair. Presente. Presente. In Agua Prieta, Mexico, we met a handful of people who had just been expelled from the United States in a shelter that provides short-term food, medicine, and very basic needs. They appeared to be exhausted and lost and defeated. Presente. Presente. We saw another shelter that can house over 100 people as they wait to enter the United States. High walls with barbed wire were there to keep them safe from the cartels that will prey on people who are waiting. We heard from two men, Julio and Alex, who told us their stories of loss, of separated families, of a burnt down home, and the helplessness of being caught between the human trafficking cartels and the U.S. Border Patrol, extortion and violence. Julio and Alex. Presente. Presente. We spent some time at the Cafe Justo coffee shop and roastery, learning about how a $20,000 loan began a sustainable, organic, fair trade coffee cooperative that now sustains over 40 families in the southern Mexican city of Chiapas. And the coffee that you drink here today, or will drink after this, is from Cafe Justo. And we, the church and individuals, currently purchase about 1,100 pounds of their coffee a year, which is just shy of the amount 1,500 pounds to sustain one family for a year. May we buy 400 more pounds this year. A $20,000 loan allowed families to make a living, educate their children, live with dignity, invest in their region, and not fall into systems of forced migration. Compare this to the billions of dollars spent on that cold wall, on border patrol, on court systems, on security. And we smelled like coffee for the next many hours. Presente. Presente. For over 20 years at 5 p.m. every Tuesday in Douglas, Arizona, just over the border from Agua Prieta, there is a vigil to remember those who died in Cochise County, one county. There are over 340 crosses, and one by one, somebody would lift it up and yell their name, or what was often the case, no identification. And then the whole vigil would shout along with them, Presente. And then it ends in a small park that abuts the boarding crossing complex, and people moving very slowly in cars trying to go into Mexico. They averted their gaze. They stared. They cried. They nodded. They, too, became present. Presente. Presente. We sat silently in a federal courthouse as 6 men pleaded guilty to entering this country without authorization. And even though this guilty plea dropped them from a felony to a petty misdemeanor, each of them was shackled, handcuffed with a chain around their waists for a petty misdemeanor. Their backs were to us for most of the proceedings, but when they left, they walked towards us and they stared back. Presente. Presente. We spent a day at Casa Alitas in Tucson. This is where ICE and Border Patrol drop off asylum seekers after they've been in detention. Most arrive with nothing. Everything has been taken from them. They have a packet of authorization papers, and they're usually wearing these almost paper-like clothing. Everything has been taken from them. And Casa Alitas provides food and clothing and sometimes shelter and any other resources that these human beings need as they take the next step on an incredibly opaque journey. Using my insufficient Spanish, I was able to help with the intake process. And I met women from Colombia, and Mexico, and Venezuela, and Guatemala. And most of them were traveling with young children. One girl was exactly 6 days younger than my own daughter. Presente. There are also many men from northern India, many from the Sikh faith tradition who spoke Hindi or Punjabi, and I did not. Nobody there did. Other days we're told that it is full of people from Russia or China or West Africa or Southeast Asia. Presente. In the reading from the book of Matthew today, Jesus was also present with people in moments of great suffering. Those who were afflicted with various diseases and oppressions, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics. He crossed political boundaries. He embodied love by not turning away from those that could be easily ignored, those that were oppressed by forces much larger than them, people that had faith and doubt, resilience and loss, pain and helplessness. Jesus was present to the suffering that came from the consequence of empire, from the consequences of living in a human body. And when he saw them, he didn't turn away. He didn't look past them at something that gave him hope. Hear this. He didn't look past the suffering to the hope that made him feel better. He didn't look past them at something more hopeful. He was present with them. Presente. As people of faith, as members of this community, as human beings, we are asked to be present to the lives of the people that surround us. And this can be absolutely overwhelming at times. Absolutely. There is so much suffering. There is so much violence and bigotry and loss caused by systems that represent us. By systems that we have some say in. And these systems need to be changed. They need to be changed if we are ever to even begin to approach the mutual thriving that God demands that we create in this world. But before we can change anything, we need to be present. We need to be witness to the suffering and the pain before we can participate in change. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain and he sat down. Then he began to speak. He sat down. and then began to speak. We get to continue practicing being comfortable with discomfort, with the discomfort of being present. Only then will we be able to see the signs of God's love that are always companions to human suffering. Resilience and love and faith and hope and compassion and creativity and kindness and peace. God is always companion in the hard stuff, but we need to be present in order to see it. Presente. 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 May we remain so.